Causing trouble, Marlene. Or Marlene. Lois. You found it? Did you really find it? No? All right. I'll wing it. No. Yeah, I'm getting sweaty doing it. All right. That's where it gets dangerous, when I don't have a script. All right. Welcome. And one of the things we had been doing was the Anabaptist study Bible thing. We couldn't do that this week anyways. They haven't gotten us our extra Bible verses. So I decided, after I had read this one book, to share this topic of the Mennonite story in Ukraine. And part and parcel, because I think it's also helpful for us to, we all sort of generally know that we have roots in Ukraine or in South Russia, but how does that compare to what we're hearing going on today? And I think that's always helpful to see those things, see how things are repeated, and to see where we came from, because nothing ever happens in a spectrum. So I'm going to try to make this work here. And I'm going to use a book, or I'm going to use the source of my knowledge, if you will, or that I'm basing the structure on, is our lectures by Paul Taves. Paul Taves was a professor of history from Fresno Pacific University, and when the Iron Curtain came down, he and an Unger family, a wife and a husband, they started doing what they called heritage tours down the Dnieper, from Kyiv down to into the Black Sea. Has anyone gone on one of those tours here? Lois, you went on what year did you go? When?
1999.
Oh, so one of the original ones. Yeah, it went for 16 years, from 95 to 2010. Who else has been in eastern Ukraine? Of course, Aaron is here. He's our most recent expert here. So anyone else? So Lois and myself and Hannah, if she was here, and Aaron have been there, and some of us have very recent roots. Kim has probably the most recent roots of parents having lived there. Pardon? No, they're not doing them. No, Paul Taves died, and I don't know if the Ungers, so after 2010, so they haven't been going for 20 or 12 years already. So much of the material I'm using is not original, so I want to make sure that when you say, wow, Pastor was awesome, that, I kind of plagiarized, not plagiarized because I'm giving him credit, Paul Taves, but I'm going to add some more specific stuff into this. This is all gathered from a book, the book that I'm looking for, that I actually bought for our library. It hasn't made it in there yet because I read it. It's been retitled, The Mennonite Story in Ukraine. And they're going to have a virtual presentation of this book from Mennonite Study Series. If you want the link, I can get that to you up in Canada. But that's the book. So, the story of Mennonites, and I'm just going to pile in, I'm going to move quick, and then we can have questions afterwards. The story of Mennonites in Tsarist Russia, and then the Soviet Union, and now in the Soviet successor states. And this is important we note that, because that's all being argued out by Putin and by the West in what exactly, what sort of claims does anybody have on Ukraine. Mennonites are part of this story. Anyways, the story of Mennonites in Tsarist Russia is relatively short, beginning only in 1789. Despite this short history, our memories of Mennonite life in this region are etched with deeply contradictory images. On the one hand, we remember this resplendent culture marked by elegance and sophistication. And we have many photos of this era. And if you even those that left in the 1870s, there's still a sense, those of us that came from Russian Mennonite have that as part of our story, that those were the golden years of Mennonitism. And actually, from about 1890 until the Revolution, right before the Revolution, is often considered the golden years, the golden age of Mennonitism, an age of absolute economic prosperity, political engagement, cultural richness, and religious vitality. And we remember that with this almost the angels sing every time we hear that. And on the other hand, we also have memories, strong memories, and we've talked about this too. We've had people come and talk to us in church of a very different kind of reality, deeply embedded in our imagination, of waste, of destruction, of pillage, of war, of fields bombed, of villages and factories laid bare, accounts of starvation, torture, and death. And if you compare those pictures to today, it seems awfully similar, especially when you put it in black and white or sepia. Not since the 16th century had the Mennonite world witnessed the kind of violence, suffering, and martyrdom that happened to our people on the Ukrainian steppe and elsewhere in the Soviet Union between the First and Second World Wars. And you'll hear me refer to the steppes of Russia or of Ukraine. That is the open, we call it prairie here, the savanna, the steppes, S-T-E-P-P-E-S. There are many ways to tell the Russian Mennonite story, the story of Mennonites in Ukraine, but three lenses will be used today and throughout in this series. The first lens is what we're going to start working on today, and that is power and promise. And then we're going to go with pathos and tragedy, and then paradox and irony. And you'll see us tease out some themes that are relevant not only to us as Mennonites here in Kansas, but the reality that we see right now in Ukraine. Let's dig in. Power and promise. In the early years of the 20th century, I can't even say this, Ekaterinoslav, which is right here, was then later in Soviet years named Dnipropetrovsk. It was, even when I was there, still called that. Now it's, I assume, just called Dnipro. You would know that better. I assume that's either the modern or the Ukrainian version of the Russian. Zaporozhye, where Aaron is right down the river. So Ukraine, if you haven't seen this on the news, is sort of split, eastern and western Ukraine, by the Dnieper River, or the Dnipro River now. And Zaporozhye is there, and Dnipro is there. Those are two main towns that we'll talk about. And you still see that today. This red line is my attempt to sort of show where the line of Russian occupation is right now. Right now, Russia is occupying these lands to the east of that red line, and Crimea since 2014. And here you have what you call the Donbass area. That's another version you hear. This is all beautiful steppe farmland. Agricultural land covers about 70% of the country. And you can see some, if you want these slides, you can see them up closer. The print is pretty small. But I'm just going to call it Dnipro, since it's easier to say, was a bustling regional center, and it showcased the political achievements of Mennonites in the Russian Empire. Mennonites occupied key political positions in this rapidly industrializing city, which again sits on the Dnieper. And right now, well, not now per se, but the population before the invasion, it was at almost 1 million people. So it's a fairly large city now. The mayor in the 1890s was a guy by the name of John Esau. And I suspect, I don't know this, I haven't done the research, but I suspect he might be remotely related to Kot Esau. You know, Kot Esau, the dentist, who just recently passed away. What, recently? 5 years ago. So the mayor of that town in the end of the 19th century, early 20th century was John Esau. Deputy mayor was a Johann Toews. And together with a Mennonite Peter Hees and Heinrich Hees, all served on the city council of this large town. Keep that in mind. I think that's incredibly interesting. But Mayor Esau and company were not the first politically involved Mennonites in the city, because already in the 1890s, Johann Fast and others had served on the city council. And it's very interesting because the bulk of the, as we'll find out, the bulk of the Mennonites were, the Mleczna and Chortica colony were right here, and Dnipro is relatively close, I guess you could say. But they were already involved in the politics of that city. As part of the economic elite, these men owned large mills, and we'll learn how in Berdyansk and Mariupol, both names of this war that we've heard, a guy by the name of Abraham Buhler had a mill in Berdyansk, and when he moved to the U.S., he moved to what would be called Buhler, Kansas, and what's one of our main industries, it was one of our main industries in town, the Buhler Mill. So that's worth noting. Other industrial businesses, they were members of board of directors of the city banks. They were the majority owners of several private banks. Interesting. A close associate of these councilors, Herman Bergman, was also active in local regional politics. Bergman was the owner of a large estate nearby with over 15,000 acres just outside the city. A little bigger than what you have, Bob. They didn't have center pivots back then. Yeah, wow is right. He served in the Russian Duma. The Duma is, throughout their history, is sort of a representative parliament. He served in the Russian Duma in St. Petersburg between 1907 to 1916. In 1912, he was joined in the Duma by Peter Schrader, probably my relative. Maybe Dave's, maybe yours too, who knows, who is also a Mennonite with a large estate in the Crimean Peninsula, down here. The Crimean Peninsula, this is flatter than Kansas land right here, and this is like more stark than the Sierra Nevadas mountains. It's quite a contrast, the geography there. Most of the Mennonites settled on the flat part. We have a tendency to like settling on flat areas. We don't like the mountains, so except to go vacationing. With two representatives, listen to this, with two representatives in the National Duma in St. Petersburg. St. Petersburg was the capital at the time of the Russian Empire. Mennonites likely constituted the, quote, as one historian has said, the most overrepresented ethnic group in the Fourth Duma. That's clout. This is pretty remarkable for a people who arrived only a century earlier as settlers and small-time artisans in search of opportunity on the steppes of South Russia. Mayor John Esau, you can see him right there. So these guys are pretty important-looking guys, at least. You can see they think highly of themselves as well. They were not of the conservative Mennonites, obviously. Conservative Mennonites wouldn't take pictures, but they did, and they had beards, which is a point to make. And that's why Old Colony Mennonites, who come out of the same tradition, believe that beards are prideful, because they were wearing, well, this is later, this picture was taken, I think, after World War I, about the 1920s. But, you know, he's got a goatee, mustache. Old Colony Mennonites will tell you, you do not talk to anyone who has a goatee. And then second, beards. We can get into that. But the point is, it represents an era of when people were being very worldly. So you already see that division in the Russian Mennonite tradition. Mayor Johann Esau and his brother Jacob were born in Mleczna colony. So down here, more down here, born in Mleczna colony, and were among the first students to study for professional training in the big city. They trained at first went to be professionalized teachers. In 1884, that's 3 years before Bethel College started here in Kansas, In 1884, Johann graduated with a degree in engineering, and he served as an engineer in Sevastopol. Right here. Sevastopol is the major harbor for the Russian fleet, and it's been for a long time in the Black Sea. Sevastopol was also the area that was heavily damaged during the Crimean War. And Mennonites, that's in the 1850s, and the Mennonites were affected by that as well. Yalta, where the Treaty of Yalta was, is right here, and then here's Sevastopol. Today, Sevastopol is still an incredibly strategic point, and that's one of the reasons the Ukrainians are trying to, if they can get to Sevastopol and start shelling that or something like that. They sank the flagship of that the Moskova here somewhere. If they can control that, wow, that would be a big coup. Jacob graduated from Kiev Medical School as a doctor in 1884. Now, during his time as mayor of what is now called Dnipro, Johann Esau negotiated a loan of 5 million gold rubles. That was $2.5 million then, in 1905, I think. That's $84 million now, from someone in Paris to modernize the city. This is a Mennonite from Malachna doing this as a mayor. With this money, he built a new water system, a sewer system, a market hall, a street line car that connected all the parts of the city. That street line was still working when I was there in 2001. I don't know, Aaron, you maybe know more about that. You didn't get to go to Dnipro. Okay. When I went, we had to fly into Dnipro and then take a car down to Zaporozhye. The flights were cheaper or something like that. At the end of his term in 1909, Esau did not run for re-election because of rising anti-German sentiment in the area. And then during World War I, which was against Germany, he was the chief administrator of the work of the Red Cross for the whole of South Russia, including Ukraine. During the German occupation, and this is how he sort of fell out of favor, and you can figure out why. During the German occupation of Ukraine at the end of World War I, Esau was installed as the mayor of Dnipro again, but by the occupiers. And when the Germans had to leave, he fled with them to Berlin, where Esau assisted the Russian Mennonite Study Commission, which was organized to report on the needs of Russian Mennonites to Mennonite communities around the world, especially in North America, and explore options of immigration. Why is that important? Because it was the 1920 visit of this commission to North America, which actually C.E. Krabel, so these aren't all Russian Mennonites actually, C.E. Krabel is from around here. And so I think that's why this is a 1920s picture taken probably in the U.S. It was this 1920 visit of this commission to North America that helped inspire the formation of MCC, Mennonite Central Committee. Very important, because when do the angels sing in our church? When we say the words MCC. And now you know the rest of the story. His ancestors continued to contribute to Mennonite institutions in North America. After they moved to North America, they have been credited with giving gifts of over $8 million to Bethel College, Canadian Bible College, which is now part of Canadian Mennonite University in Winnipeg, Manitoba, and Menno Simons College, also in Winnipeg. So, a big legacy. But Esau's story, you might be thinking, well, okay, that's one guy. But Esau's story, Taves says, is not an outlier in the Russian Empire political involvement of the Mennonites. People like Cornelius Jansen. Have any of you ever been to Jansen, Nebraska? There you go, Jansen, Nebraska, named after Cornelius Jansen. He was born there. Okay. Your dad was a Crimmer? Crimmer MBs they joined the MBs when they got here, but the Crimmer brethren started in the Crimea. Cornelius Jansen was from the Crimea. And in the 1870s, he was one of the proponents. He put together, along with people like Dietrich Gaddert, do you know that name? Of Hoffnungsau. You're related. I know Jason back there, Nita, Daryl, you all kind of through marriage you are. those sort of people, they went straight to the Tsar, straight to St. Petersburg as a delegation, and he was one of the first that pushed that. And it was over the issue of nonviolence and military service. And we won't get into why that had come up, but Russia had changed their laws on the heels of what had happened in the Crimean War and the revolutions that had happened through that. There were guys like Isbrand Friesen, Johann Jansen, Johann Cornys, very familiar names, that were also very involved politically. Through this, they developed a network of relationships with the imperial bureaucracy in St. Petersburg, often staying in St. Petersburg for months on end. It's a long trip, if you think about it. They live here. St. Petersburg is probably right about here. Moscow is probably right about here. Most of this was done, but not exclusively, most of this was done to protect their arrangements for alternative military service so they can maintain their pacifism and their nonviolence. One of the more intriguing stories of this period, I think, was the formation of a political party by P.M. Friesen. Has anyone heard? Are you related to P.M. Friesen? Probably. He's an MB. He wrote the seminal work of MB history and also helped write one of the MB Confessions of Faith. That's what he's known for. But anyways, he studied in Switzerland. That's pretty major. He studied in Odessa and in Moscow. Odessa was a pretty big cultural center. Odessa right here. Cultural center for the Tsars and Tsarist Russia. Anyways, he started following the revolution of 1905, Tsar Nicholas II announced that a representative parliament would be convened which resulted in the formation of a ton of different political parties. Because this was going to be the People's Duma, and people, anyone who had any sort of vested interest started a party. So there were a ton of these parties going on, political parties. Maybe other parties too, I don't know. Throughout the Russian Empire, not just in South Russia. Now Friesen, P.M. Friesen, helped organize, we won't go to that picture yet. I have a picture of him somewhere. He's a stately looking guy, as they all were. Anyways, he's organized a party in Sevastopol, down here in the Crimean Peninsula. The party's name was this. Now remember this is going to be on the test. The Union of Freedom, Truth, and Peace, Forces Against All Violence, Proponents of Unceasing Civil, Economic, and Moral Spiritual Progress Party. I think they pretty much put everything we as Mennonites liked in, and I think that was their platform in their name, it sounds like.
How did you pronounce acronym?
No. Their acronym was longer than most words. No, it was more commonly known as the Union of Freedom, or the Friesen Party. Yeah. The most distinctive characteristic of the party was its avowedly Christian character. As the last plank of their platform, they called for, quote, the complete realization of the teachings of Jesus Christ. Imagine if Christian parties of today would put that in their plank. The complete realizations of the teachings of Jesus Christ. That means the Sermon on the Mount. Remember Christocentric hermeneutic? It comes right in here. For Friesen, this included alternative service for all conscientious objectors to war. It also included land redistribution. And universal suffrage for all people. That means even women got to vote. Yes. Yeah. Woo! Radical. Yeah. It's interesting, though. Yeah. Well, the party was ultimately unsuccessful, but it represented the interests of the emerging evangelical community. Though he was the center of it, and the Mennonites sort of pushed the bulk of this, other evangelical Mennonites in the area. And you have to remember the Russian Empire was mostly Russian Orthodox was the official religion, and others were not supposed to even proselytize. They joined this platform. and it sort of brought them to prominence in some ways. These stories of political activism seem uncharacteristic for Mennonites in Russia, especially considering they were essentially an agrarian people marked by a very high amount of geographical and cultural segregation, purposely trying to segregate because of faith reasons. We see that happening here in Kansas. We see that happening in Latin America today. What was going on, and how might it relate today? Why did I tell this story? Well, I'm going to end by contextualizing the story. I just got to better make sure that's not Hannah saying wrap it up. No. Let's contextualize the story. This is important because nothing ever happens in a vacuum. And often when we tell a story we have this whole story about how Catherine the Great invited us in, and it's a good story. It's not inaccurate, but we often tell it as this sort of story removed from a bigger event. And that bigger event is what's still driving the events for today, I would say. And it is, after all, still part of our BMC story. Whether you got grafted into this story or you have relatives on the Crimean Peninsula starting parties, political parties, maybe other parties too, I don't know. Well, we won't be able to do all of that today, but I want to end with a brief overview of the story of Mennonite migration to Russia. Like, how did they get there? How did we end up in this part of the world? And then we're going to dig in a little bit deeper as we bring in some of these other areas, bring in other people as well. Now, the story of Mennonites in Russia began in the late 1780s. 1780s. When did the United States become a nation? 76. So how many years later did the Mennonites move to Russia? 4 years. That's kind of interesting, isn't it? So think of what was all happening in the world at that time. And here the Mennonites are moving east. These Mennonites are moving east. The vast majority, so what we have here are two maps, and it's always good to see different maps. This is basically a map from this, if Russia drew this map, this would be red and this would be red. Actually, all of Ukraine would probably be red if they got to... What's that? Yeah, right. And remember, Russia isn't just Europe either. The bulk of Russia is Asia. But anyways, in 1780, when the Mennonites are moving, this is what the map kind of looked like. There is no Finland. There's kind of Norway, but you've got this is different. Poland looks a lot different. And after this point, it actually disappeared from the map and reappeared, and you have all sorts of empires moving around after World War I and this sort of thing. But look how large the Russian Empire is right here. Poland here at this time actually owns part of, or occupies part of Ukraine here, the western side of Ukraine. Well, the Mennonites came out of what's called the Vistula Delta, and also the Gdansk, the Gdansk area on the Vistula River. So that put people in both Poland and also in what was considered Prussia at the time. And then soon thereafter, a lot of stuff got repartitioned, and there's all sorts of political movement. Anyways, the bulk of the Mennonites came from here. Now, Beatrice Mennonites and First Mennonite Church people, they moved directly from the U.S. to here, or directly from here to the U.S. U.S. is over here. They never went to the Russian Mennonite experience. They moved straight over.
Except for those that went on the trek.
Yeah, except for those that went on the trek, and that's a whole different story that we covered about 8 years ago. Yeah, right. And remember we had the story of Mr. Friesen, as he told about escaping World War II. He came and talked during Sunday school last year. He was from this area as well. So they were on two different sides there. Why did they move? And they had moved there from Holland. And Aaron is wearing the Dutch national jersey for today for that. So Menno Simons and Olbe Phillips, they had slowly been moving to this area. The more conservatives had been moving to this area and settling the lowlands there. Friesland is like right here. You're just on a Friesen theme. Prussia, on this map, Prussia is kind of this blue area right here. And then it goes over here. Well, Friesland is probably more like right there. But Friesland is a part of, probably of Holland mostly right now. Yeah. So those are the type of Mennonites, Anabaptists that we find there. Mennonites from Prussia were granted, generally, exemption from military conscription before the 1860s. But with all of this militarism and this heightened sense of nationalism, and you also have to remember 1812, who had just marched through there all the way to Moscow? Napoleon. And he had wreaked a lot of havoc. So all these people are jockeying, building up armies, making sure this never happens again. But you could be nonviolent and you could be a pacifist, but you couldn't own land after the 1860s. Well, Mennonites love having babies. And we grow. That's our mode of evangelization, is having babies. And they expanded. Well, what do you do with the landless? So you have an issue there, and they want to stay nonviolent. Some of them, they did go into the military so they could buy land, so there's a little bit of whatever. But you couldn't buy more land if you didn't serve in the military. This situation encouraged Mennonites to search for new lands, which coincided with the extension of the Russian Empire, expansion of it. Actually, just before the Mennonites moved, the border was probably right here. Right here. But the Russian Empire had just kicked out, I don't know what that was, it had just kicked out a whole bunch of Muslims, of Cossacks, of people of the Ottoman Empire. It had been part of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire was in decline. That was a Muslim, Islamic people. And the Russian Empire had just kicked them out of the steppes, cleaned out all of these natives and some leftover, as Nick was saying, leftover from the Mongolian Empire of Genghis Khan, of others. Non-Christian people had just kicked them out. Does that sound familiar? Does that sound familiar? Yes. On the borderlands. What do you do after you've just kicked out the natives? What do? You bring in, not just Mennonites, you bring in tons of Eastern Europeans. The Mennonites were just a tenth of all the people that were invited in to settle, because they who settle rule. They who settle conquer. At the same time, you had Mennonites that were leaving Switzerland and moving to the U.S. That's your people. So you have Mennonites leaving Europe, going straight to the U.S., and others going east. The Dutch Mennonites mostly went east. They who settle rule. The migration of Mennonites into Russia was part of a larger movement of people. And the Russians, Peter the Great and then Catherine, they would actively recruit farmers from here to get them to farm the borderlands, just like they did for Kansas and Nebraska and areas that had just recently been cleared of Native Americans. It's the same thing they did in Canada. Canada had just had one of the treaties, and they were having issues with the U.S. not quite knowing where the border was. So they settled the boundaries with Mennonites. That's what they did in Paraguay, and Paraguay got the settlers, and they established that territory as their own. And there was a war that followed. The same thing that's happened now in eastern Bolivia, and so forth. So it's something that repeats itself. We got to get moving here. They moved into two different colonies from that point on. See, so imagine this as this area right here. This is the Embiggen view. Here's the Crimean. Here's the Dnieper River. Alexandrovsk is the name that was before Zaporozhye, which is now Zaporizhia. The first group was the Khortytsa colony, which moved in 1789. They moved to this bank, this side of the river, the same side of the river that Aaron lived on, and you had to cross the bank. And in the middle is, and this is where they get the name, Khortytsa. How would you say it in Russian? That's how Khortytsa. This is the Khortytsa Island, right here, the largest island in Europe, by the way. Anyways, they were granted this piece of ground, and it was the equivalent of 89,000 acres. And so people moved there. It was a rough beginning. Most of these people were artisans and not necessarily agrarian. And so they suffered for a little while. Not only that, a guy by the name of Hepner, Jacob Hepner and Johann Bartsch, who spied out the land, they didn't want this land. They had found land over here, but somehow they got diverted and they got stuck with this land. So people were mad at him. And by the way, I'm relatives with Randy Sawatsky through Jacob Hepner. Hepner settled on this island, and he was buried on this island. And then after the revolution, he had an obelisk there. After the revolution, that obelisk was taken back to Steinbach, Manitoba, where it sits, and there's still bullet holes in the obelisk there. They do. Okay, very good, yeah. And each of these areas, all were developed into these row villages, and I've talked about those before, and I won't go into that right now. Molochna colony was then down here. So you have what's called Kortica, which is considered the old colony. That's where we get the word old coloniers from. So, he might be old. I was pointing at Henry Banman, who is boyfriend to Holly. It comes from old colony tradition. That doesn't mean their beliefs. It has to do with which colony they come from. Molochna, which we hear a lot about, which most of the Kansas Mennonites who moved here in 1874 came from Molochna. In fact, you can't see it on this map. Oh, well, yeah, there it is. Alexanderville is like right there. That's where the bulk of the Hoffnungsauers and the Alexandervollers came that moved here. Tokmak, if you hear about the town Tokmak, that's up here. That's a major place that the Russians are holding because of the railroad crossings and everything. And then Neuhauptstadt, what is the name of Neuhauptstadt now? I can't think of it either. Anyways, it's a name that you hear quite often, and there's still and you still see buildings and everything in that area. So Mennonites had autonomy over those lands, over themselves. They didn't have to go to the army. They had a whole thing, a set of privileges called the privilegium, which they tried to repeat to every movement they made. They came to the U.S. and they actually met with Ulysses S. Grant in person, the leaders, in order to get this privilegium, but they said, you know what, guys, you'll be moving to Kansas. There are no laws out there. Don't worry about society, and you'll have your way out there. When Grant was president. And they did mention he was drunk, which, surprise, surprise, he was drunk most of the time after the Civil War. But they met directly, and they have a history of doing this, going to the leaders directly. Now, they felt like they had gotten the correct promises from Canada when they moved, but in the 1920s, when Canada anglicized in contest against the French part of the Canadians, they felt like those promises were reneged on, and that's when a bunch of people moved to Mexico and a bunch moved to Paraguay. Beside the point. Okay, so you kind of see now how the Mennonites get to this part. This is all today under Russian control right now. The border is about, I don't know exactly where, but right about there. Zaporizhia is not. It gets shelled from time to time, right? Or
not as bad as it had been there, even like the Dnepro.
Yeah, Dnepro gets much worse up here. Zaporizhia was a city of how much?
It's around, I think it's 900,000.
900,000. Yeah, very industrial city. Yeah, but the Mennonites were right up to that city. Even across the river, they had some villages and factories that are part of Zaporizhia now. There's Berdyansk. There's Mariupol. Berdyansk, again, is where the progenitor of the Buhler mills came from. So they milled all of this wheat that they grew here, the Turkey Red, got shipped down to the mills here, and then into the Black Sea, through the Bosphorus and Dardanelles, and then wherever it needed to go. So, next week we're going to talk a bit about the Russian context. I want to make it a little bit bigger. And then we're going to talk about struggles between civil and church leaders, and there comes the question of what about the MBs that you asked last week. And Oh, well, your ears will be ringing then. Disputes over land, how land was partitioned, why some people moved to America or moved all around Russia. And in 1943, up till 1943, this was the extent of where Mennonites had settled or were shipped to in the Soviet Union. You notice not everything is in Russia. This is that story that you were talking about Beatrice people that moved out east to Kazakhstan, and then some that moved out even further here and then escaped across the river and spent a lot of time in Harbin, China. Did you ever think about Mennonite settlements in China? They did for a long while, and a bunch of those then moved to California. Any questions really quickly before Hannah really cuts me off?
Question for you. Jensen, Nebraska, PM freezing and an AM freezing. In Jensen, Nebraska,
Blue.
there's a AM and PM freezing very right next to each other. Are they any part of
I don't know. That's good, worth researching. If that's the PM freezing that, it
So you want to be buried in between.
well, then it probably is. Those two are pretty high holy MBs, trimmer MBs. Yeah. Yes, sir.
At the beginning of this presentation, it was pretty impressive how the Mennonites played such a role in the government. I mean, they were.
So that it's.
But don't you think contemporary Mennonites do not want their members to be involved in the government?
And that's a paradox. That's a huge paradox because the Mennonites that moved to the United States absolutely withdrew themselves from. But because the Mennonites here were basically nations within a nation, they didn't have the easement of what we call two kingdom theology, that the church is one kingdom and the government is another kingdom, and there the twain shall meet, actually, for Mennonites. But that is the tension, and that's what marks the Russian Mennonite experience in a really interesting way.
We still have some of the vestiges of that.
Yes.
The two kingdoms.
Absolutely, we totally struggle with that, and that would be a whole topic of a whole thing called church and state. Yeah, absolutely. And in Paraguay, we now have Mennonites that are running for president of Paraguay. Yeah.
Whoa.
What? No, that's not me announcing a bid yet. But in Bolivia, the more conservatives, they're not there yet. But all of them will go directly to the seats of power and engage them.